Hi, my name is Chenny Hindocha. I'm from the Clinical Psychopharmacology Unit at University College London. I will take you through some stuff about cannabis, about tobacco, and one of the first experimental studies about their co-use in joints that has been conducted in the UK. So I'm sure you know that the primary psychoactive ingredient of cannabis is THC, and it gives the characteristic effects of getting people stoned or high. It also impairs memory and induces psychotic-like symptoms such as paranoia. And in Spain, although I think these data are a little bit old, 30.4% have said that they have tried cannabis at least once. Tobacco, on the other hand, has the primary psychoactive ingredient of nicotine. It improves memory in smokers and in non-smokers. And recently, there's evidence from epidemiology that suggests that it's an independent predictor of psychosis. And in Spain, about 3/4 of people have reported trying tobacco at least once. So people who use cannabis and tobacco together are called co-users. There are concurrent users. These are more like you would find in the US, where they smoke cigarettes and they also smoke cannabis, but they keep them separate. These people have more trouble with cannabis cessation. They have poorer psychiatric and psychosocial outcomes, and they have more severe symptoms of cannabis use disorder because of the association with cigarettes. There are also simultaneous users who report heavier general substance use problems. They're more likely to meet criteria for dependence according to the DSM, and more likely to smoke, to be more regular users. In Europe and in Spain and in the UK, there's also a third type of user which we hear less about, which is the person who smokes joints like this simultaneously, but also smokes cigarettes, leaving an extra level of harm that we don't really talk about. In research, though, it's very difficult to control for these both types of smoking and the third type of having joints and smoking cigarettes. So these two drugs are incredibly common worldwide. Lots and lots and lots of people use them. There's an overwhelming association between them. But tobacco use generally comes before cannabis use, and this is called the gateway hypothesis, developed by Candle in 1975, a very old hypothesis. But there's also evidence to suggest that there's this reverse gateway where people use cannabis first and then they go on to develop a nicotine dependence. And I'm sure you can see that this data is very much like American-centric, because in the UK and in Spain, it's more like this, where people smoke cannabis and tobacco together at first, and so then they go on to develop both a cannabis addiction and a nicotine addiction, and it's very hard to separate those things out. The relationship between the two drugs is very complicated, and it acts at a lot of different levels. At the neurobiological level, at the receptor level, at a cultural level, where people will say, this is just what everyone else does, so this is how I smoke my cannabis. At a social level, through peer pressure and through in childhood and adolescence. And an economic level where it's cheaper to mix the two together than to just smoke cannabis on its own, so people mix the two. So it's really important that we understand how these drugs interact. From a public health perspective, the users tend to ignore the consequences of smoking joints with tobacco. So we did this study a couple of years ago where we had 600 cannabis users, 300 of them smoked also cigarettes. And we found that cigarette use mediates the relationship between cannabis use and cannabis dependence. So this relationship between the amount of days you use cannabis and your score on dependence weakened when you added tobacco into the mix. But like most of the studies that exist at the moment, this does not account for simultaneous cannabis and tobacco use. So we wanted to know how many people use cannabis and tobacco worldwide, because the epidemiological evidence and the questions in the epidemiology don't tend to ask this. So we had data from 30,000 people from the Global Drug Survey. Anyone who used cannabis at least once was asked what is their most common way of using cannabis. A few of them were tobacco-based, for example, a joint with tobacco. A few of them were non-tobacco-based, so a joint without tobacco or a pipe without tobacco, and a few others, vaporizer, food, drinking. Very few people actually answered those ones. So in Spain, we had 820 respondents. 86.4 said they used a tobacco way of smoking cannabis, be it a joint, a pipe, a blunt, but only 1% said pipe, blunt, etc. Most people said joint. And the most common non-tobacco way of using cannabis was through a pipe. Being someone who used a tobacco route of administration decreased odds of wanting to quit smoking cigarettes. So it suggests that having cannabis and tobacco together in joints makes you less likely to want to quit cigarettes. So it's really important that any interventions that we have that target cannabis use need to target tobacco. But more data is needed, because this can tell us something about the epidemiology, but we need experimental evidence too. So that's what we did. We recently finished this study to investigate the individual and combined effects of cannabis and tobacco in joints. And because I'm a psychologist, we wanted to look at memory, these psychotic-like experiences, dose per joint, like how much cannabis and tobacco goes into a joint, and how those different joints made people feel. So this is how the study worked. They came in for a baseline visit where they were not intoxicated. And then they came in for another 4 sessions. One where they smoked active cannabis with active nicotine, so a regular joint, a normal joint. One with placebo cannabis and active nicotine. Placebo cannabis is a cannabis with the THC removed. One with active cannabis and placebo nicotine, which is tobacco with the nicotine removed. And then a placebo, so one which had no effect. These were all blind to both the participant and me, and they happened in a random order. Our participants were 24 healthy cannabis and tobacco users, so regular joint smokers. The way that we gave them the drug was like this. So here is the amount that they smoked, and we added this section in because we didn't want them to smoke up here, because it gets very hot on the mouth and that's uncomfortable for someone. It had 67 milligrams of cannabis, 311 of tobacco. They smoked in a paced way, so it was fixed. So they had to take like a 3 or 4 second inhalation, hold that breath for a little while, and then exhale. And everyone did it in the same way to control for different ways that people smoke. The first thing we looked at is something called episodic memory. This is your memory for daily events. So they listened to a 30-second news clip, and then they wrote down everything that they could remember. And then an hour later, they were asked to remember the story and write down everything they could remember again. Sometimes being on cannabis, sometimes tobacco, depending on their condition. We found that if you listen to the story after smoking active cannabis, your recall was impaired. And if you listened to the story after active tobacco, your recall was improved. And we found an improvement of cannabis and tobacco in comparison to cannabis alone, which suggests that tobacco might compensate for some of the negative cognitive effects of cannabis, potentially one of the reasons why people might use them together. We also looked at working memory, which is your ability to hold information and manipulate that information at the time. The way that this works is called an N-back procedure. I won't explain it, but the main thing I will say is that there are 3 stages with increasing difficulty, so it gets harder. We found very similar results. So cannabis made you worse with greater difficulty of the task, which you can see on this one, which is the hardest one. They're really poor in comparison to placebo. Tobacco improved working memory, but unlike here, the effect is always generally the same amount. We also looked at these psychotic-like effects, given that cannabis has such a strong reputation for inducing psychotic-like symptoms. Tobacco recently has been also considered as an independent predictor of these symptoms of psychosis at a population level. But we wanted to look at this on an acute drug level. We didn't find that anything happened. So cannabis, yes, increased the scores on this scale that measures psychotic-like symptoms, regardless of whether it was with tobacco or without. And tobacco and placebo don't do anything, but I think that's quite an encouraging result. I also want to talk about dose. So it's really important to have good statistics about cannabis use. A lot of people don't want to ever admit that they use cannabis, so in surveys, the rates of cannabis use can sometimes be not the true rate. It's really important for policy, but it also allows us to estimate how much tobacco is in the joint, so how much extra exposure there is to tobacco. And no study has ever done this before. The way that we did this was we compared how much cannabis and how much tobacco someone would sprinkle on rolling paper. So here, put how much tobacco you would normally put in a joint, and then put how much cannabis you would normally put in the joint. And then we asked them, how much is this and how much is this? Then we took the actual weights, and this is what we found. And we did it when they were not intoxicated and when they were intoxicated. So when they were not intoxicated, we found that they estimated they were putting double the amount of cannabis they actually put. So the estimated amount was double the real amount, suggesting that these the estimates of cannabis use are quite unreliable. If you ask someone, if they report it, they say, I actually use about 0.3, but it seems like they're using a lot less. They were accurate in estimating the amount of tobacco. And we hypothesized this was because tobacco comes in standardized weights, whereas cannabis, the information is always, under a black market, the information is always less consistent. So they can estimate the amount of tobacco because they know the tobacco weights. When they were intoxicated, they added less cannabis to their joints, which makes sense because an hour previous they had had some cannabis already. They also added less tobacco to their joints once they had smoked active cannabis, but actually, regardless of the nicotine in the joint, there was no difference in the amount of either cannabis or tobacco they put in. You would think that after smoking some tobacco later on, you would want to put less tobacco in your joint because you've already had some, equivalent to the cannabis result here. But this wasn't the case. So I would just suggest when you look at statistics for how much cannabis people are smoking, to take it with a pinch of salt because these might be less accurate than you think they are. I realize that maybe you don't use the word stoned in Spain, but it's equivalent to high. So the positive, subjective effect that you get from the drug. So here, what you can see is before the drug and after the drug on a scale that measures how high or how stoned you are. This dark line is cannabis and tobacco together, and this dotted line is cannabis alone. This is tobacco alone, and this is the placebo. And what you can see is that after the drug, there's no difference in the positive subjective effect, which does beg the question, why do people mix tobacco with cannabis, given that one of the reasons people often say is that it makes the effects better, it makes me feel more high. It doesn't seem to be the case in this experimental study. What we do see, though, is that it does increase some of the negative effects. For dizzy, which is not a positive experience, there's a clear distinction between the cannabis and tobacco and the cannabis alone. And also for heart rate. And there are some other effects, cardiovascular effects too, which should be out like in 2 weeks. The paper will be out in like 2 weeks, and it'll be open for anyone to read, so you can find it and anyone can read it. You don't have to have like a subscription. So I thought I'd give you some take-home messages. Adding cannabis and tobacco have opposite effects on memory. Adding tobacco to cannabis can protect or compensate for some of these negative cognitive effects of cannabis. This might reinforce use because the negative effects are slightly reduced. We need more research about that. There was no effects of tobacco on psychotic-like experiences, but this doesn't negate the fact that in epidemiology, we see tobacco as an independent predictor of psychosis. Self-report dose per joint is not necessarily an accurate way of measuring the amount of cannabis, but it is for tobacco. And together, they don't make you feel more stoned, but it does have a worse effect on heart rates, disease, blood pressure as well. So if it doesn't make you feel good, why do people do it? And that's why we need more research. Again, it could be down to economic, social, or cultural reasons. Okay. Now I'm going to go on to just talking about some challenges that we face for the future about this topic. Firstly, just a tiny bit about what's going on in the world. To some extent, about 26 states have legalized cannabis in some form, whether it be medicinal CBD or full recreational legalization. And Canada will have full recreational legalization this year. And some European countries have lessened or abolished their sanctions. Importantly, we have to think about Europe and what will happen given the huge rate of co-use. So in order to tackle the potential knock-on effects on tobacco, we need to think about how we're doing research. We need to know how many cannabis users smoke joints and what other routes of administration they use, who also smoke cigarettes, who is the most vulnerable to addiction, and how many people indeed do transition to addiction. In order to get a better description of the gateway effect, we need to know the age of first use for a cannabis alone, tobacco alone, but also together. Because a lot of people, their first use of cannabis will be cannabis and tobacco together. And we need to do controlled experimental work to figure out the physiological and psychological impact of these two drugs together. In clinical practice, we find that tobacco use generally goes underreported because it's not their primary concern. People would go to the doctor and say, I have a problem with cannabis. Also, I have a problem with tobacco, but not, I have a problem with cannabis and tobacco. The data suggests that dual abstinence should be promoted if possible, but a lot of people would prefer to quit tobacco and continue to smoke cannabis. Nicotine replacement therapy has some potential beneficial effects, but the evidence is actually quite weak, which is why we need more randomized control trials to see if NRT works for these particular users. And motivational interviewing seems like it works very well, which is a psychological way of increasing motivation to quit. From a public health perspective, we can't really forget that there's going to be an effect on tobacco use with any policy changes regarding cannabis, be them pro or against. And so smoking cessation services should be adapted with this in mind. And any health promotion campaigns should aim to try and dissociate these two drugs, and especially in young people, because there's a potential that we'll have a generation of people who are never exposed to tobacco if we're able to do this, if we're able to dissociate these two drugs. I wanted to mention vaping because it's a particular interest of mine. We wrote this short report about how vaping might be the way to do this. Vaping is where you heat the cannabis to release the cannabinoids, but you don't burn the cannabis, therefore all the carcinogenic stuff that is created via burning is no longer a problem. About 8% of people, based on data from, I think it's 4 years ago now, so because it was actually data collected in 2013, 8% of people said that they use vaping, mostly in the US. It's not very common here. It could be the alternative way for medicinal users, but people think it's a safer and more positive experience. But we know very little about vaping. There's absolutely no regulation, so we don't know how well it works, how efficient it is, what are the positive or negative side effects. It's very expensive to get one of these devices, so that's off-putting for users, even if they wanted to use less tobacco in their joints. There's huge amounts of variability, and it's a design issue rather than a scientific issue at the moment. But we should consider developing products that will help dissociate these two drugs. This is a table from this paper, which I just wanted to point to you in case you wanted to think about how we might, what strategies we might use to dissociate cannabis and tobacco even further. And so there are some strategies and some future directions. And I also wanted to point you towards the Evict Group's report, which I found very helpful and really interesting. They've done some really good work, and it's very thoughtful work. And I stole the title Anatomy of a Joint from one of their reports, because it's a good title. This is my lab. There's my supervisor and my postdoc, and I'm funded by the Medical Research Council. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.